welcome to the fourth Tocqueville event of the year and the first of this spring semester. Doesn't look very springy, but we'll get there. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. I hope you received one of these brochures at the door when you came in. If not, there are plenty there for you. It contains a QR code and website information that will allow you to sign up for our announcements and donate to our work. A quick glance at the final two topics for the year will surely entice you back. Next month, we will look at American foreign policy, and in April, we'll examine populism in America. I'm sure you're going to want to attend those events. For those of you not familiar with the Tocqueville Center, we try to ask the big questions at the heart of political, economic, and social life in America. We host scholars and public intellectuals to help us explore these questions in deeper and more informed ways. We also have a group of students called the Tocqueville Fellows who commit to spending much of their valuable free time reading and discussing important texts. And I don't do this every time, but I am going to ask you all to stand up. Those of you who are here, Tocqueville Fellows, yeah. Good job, folks. Thank you very much. They spend their time reading, discussing important texts, interacting more deeply with invited speakers, and providing logistical help for our public events. They are rewarded for their efforts at the end of the year with a weekend retreat in Asheville, North Carolina, led by a prominent political theorist, who this year is Raul Rodriguez of the University of Texas at Austin, and also a graduate of Furman University. Now, why am I telling you this? First, because if you are a student, I would like you to consider applying for next year's Fellows program. It's open to students of all majors, and applications will soon be out, so watch for those. But the second reason is this. A week and a half ago, we got word that the Tocqueville Center has received a $1 million gift to endow the Tocqueville Fellows program. This extraordinary, thank you very much. This extraordinary gift will allow us to build out the best program of its kind anywhere in the United States. We are so looking forward to bringing our big dreams to fruition for our students. Just in case you think, however, that this gift is all Tocqueville needs to fulfill its mission, think again. If you have a spare $1 million, we could put it to good use. So consider using that QR code at the back of the brochure and just drop it in the website today. All right, enough excitement. On to the task at hand. As I mentioned before, Alexis de Tocqueville, a young French aristocrat, was interested in everything American when he toured the new United States in 1831. His famous book, Democracy in America, offers insights that still resonate today. Tocqueville, interestingly, had much to say about the American family as a bulwark of equality and a bedrock of American society. He marveled at the families with which he came in contact in America, and famously remarked enthusiastically, "Certainly, of all countries in the world, America is the one in which the marriage tie is most respected and where the highest and truest conception of conjugal happiness has been conceived." Tonight and tomorrow night, we will explore whether that general observation is still true of American families. With us for the next 2 days are two of the very best students of the American family, Brad Wilcox and Melissa Kearney. Dr. Wilcox will speak to us tonight, and weather willing, Dr. Kearney tomorrow night. And for some of you who came to hear both of them, I know that was advertised, but plane flights and schedules did not allow Professor Kearney to get here until later this evening. So come back tomorrow night to hear both of them. Before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you how we will proceed. First, Professor Wilcox will speak. We will then bring up a response panel, including Franklin Ellis and David Fleming, and I'll introduce them later, to discuss Brad's talk. And finally, we will open to questions from the floor. So store up your questions for the Q&A. Now to our speaker. Brad Wilcox is professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Wilcox earned a BA as a Jefferson Scholar at the University of Virginia and later earned his PhD from Princeton University. Prior to coming to the University of Virginia, he held research fellowships at Princeton, Yale, and the Brookings Institution. Dr. Wilcox studies marriage, fatherhood, and the impact of strong and stable families on men, women, and children. He is the author and co-author of 6 books and has written for prominent scientific journals and media sites. He is a co-author of Gender and Parenthood, Biological and Social Scientific Perspectives with Kathleen Kovner Kline, and with Nicholas Wolfinger, he is the co-author of Soulmates, Religion, Sex, Love, and Marriage Among African Americans and Latinos. He is most recently the author of Get Married, Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. Now, that's quite a title. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Brad Wilcox, who will speak to us on Mammon or Marriage, How to Maximize Happiness in Life and Love. The old computer switcheroo here.
Thank you, Brent. It's wonderful to be here with all of you tonight at Furman. I want to begin actually appropriately enough by giving a shout out to my wife, Danielle, who's back at home with our kids enjoying a lot of snow. And I'm grateful to her for a lot of things, but I'm also grateful to her for the opening story that I'm going to share with you tonight now as we get started here. And it's the story of King Midas. This is really her idea to kind of begin with this story. So King Midas had a good life. He worked hard to protect his kingdom. He was respected by his subjects, and he loved his daughter. But it wasn't enough. He wasn't as popular, as powerful, as rich as some of the other monarchs in Asia Minor. Midas wanted to stand out as a singularly successful sovereign. One day he got a shot at his ambition. Dionysus, the god of wine, offered Midas one wish. "I want everything I touch to turn to gold," said King Midas. "Are you sure, Midas?" said Dionysus. "This could end badly." But Midas answered in the affirmative. Midas got his wish. He walked about his kingdom, turning everything that he could into gold. At first, he was gleeful, thinking of all the riches and glory that would come his way. Midas started to daydream about his ambitious agenda to take his kingdom into the 21st century and the New York Times profile and multi-million follower count on Insta that would follow. But when Midas returned to his castle, he was in for some surprises. He tried to have a meal, but everything he ate turned to gold. This got him a bit worried. And unbeknownst to him, his daughter came up behind him to give him a kiss. And before he could warn her, she kissed him and was also turned to gold. Midas realized that he'd made a grave mistake. His beloved had been turned into a rock. Despair filled his heart. This power he had sought with such a singular focus, Midas realized, was not a blessing, but a curse. Again, not a blessing, but a curse. This ancient fable, in my view, could not be more relevant for our day. The new elite messaging we're getting online, in the media, and in the academy about work and freedom and family is advancing a kind of Midas mindset. This mindset discounts the importance of marriage and family. Fulfillment, we're told, is to be found in a rewarding career, in money, and in freedom from all of the encumbrances of family life. So the message is kind of that really is that Mammon is more important than marriage and family in much of our culture today. So, what am I talking about? What are some examples of this idea kind of represented in our culture today? Well, as I was finishing up the writing for the book that Brent just showed you, Get Married, there was a headline trending on Twitter, and it said this, that women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer. It was from an article in Bloomberg, and it kind of purported to argue, again, as you can see here, that women who steered clear of both marriage and motherhood were richer than their female peers who were getting married and having kids. And actually, the marriage point is completely wrong, but it was obviously kind of signaling a certain kind of view about marriage and motherhood. And not only did this article kind of underline the idea that kind of the path to financial success ran away from the family, it also kind of underlined the idea that kind of the path to fulfillment for women today ran away from the family as well. It spotlighted probably 3 or 4 single and childless women who were kind of living their best life. Women like Ashley Marrero, who's pictured up here on the screen, who talked about enjoying splitting her time between high-end properties in New York City and the Jersey Shore, and taking frequent travel for pleasure as well as work. Someone who was unencumbered both by marriage and by motherhood. So the message in this article from Bloomberg was pretty clear. Money, work, and freedom from family were the recipe for a meaningful and happy life. Or in Ashley's words, quote, "I love my life and feel very fulfilled." Again, apart, from a spouse and apart from having any children. Now, I think to have a kind of conservative guy speaking to you about how, the mainstream press can kind of minimize or devalue marriage and family life, not necessarily all that surprising, right? But we're kind of now seeing a view that's roughly parallel to the one articulated in Bloomberg, coming not from the left, but also, of course, from the right. And of course, targeting not women, but now targeting men. So what we're seeing is that figures like Andrew Tate here on the right and Pearl Davis on the left are also kind of telling men that the path of fulfillment runs away from marriage and family and towards making a lot of money, in their case, getting strong and using, but not investing in the opposite sex. And that's because in their estimation, marriage is a dead end for men. So Pearl Davis describes it as a death sentence for men. And then Andrew Tate says that there is zero statistical advantage when it comes to marriage for men today. So again, kind of people on the left now and on the right as well are kind of giving us this message that we should steer clear of marriage and family and focus instead on career and money, kind of living your best life, and practically, again, using but not really investing in the opposite sex. And spreading this Midas mindset is kind of percolated down to my students at the University of Virginia, students like Holly, for instance, who said this kind of about her perspective. She said, UVA students are definitely more focused on their education and getting their career started than getting into a serious relationship. If it happens, great. But the focus is definitely on building our own brands first. Basically, the thought process is relationships and love are risk, but you'll always have your career and success to fall back on, at least while you're young. Okay, so again, she's kind of got this, I think, outsized view that sort of the real thing in life is not love and relationships, it's really career and success. These are the things that we should be aiming for. And this kind of perspective is more and more common in the culture. We see a lot of polls from Pew and the Wall Street Journal, for instance, kind of giving us a sense that this Midas mindset is in the ascendancy, particularly among younger adults. But this is just kind of one survey that kind of tells you that people have kind of more confidence that work is the path of fulfillment rather than marriage and family. But part of the work that I do as a social scientist is to kind of look at the data. And what do the data kind of tell us about happiness in America, the path to happiness in America, the path to the pursuit of happiness, to paraphrase the Declaration? Well, they do tell us, as kind of the Midas mindset, proponents might suggest that things like education, work, and money matter, but marriage outpaces education, work, and money when it comes to happiness in America. And in fact, nothing compares to a good marriage when it comes to predicting happiness in America. So as I've looked at what's called the General Social Survey, the GSS, which is a kind of a large national survey conducted every 2 years by the University of Chicago, what I see in that data basically is that, yes, getting a college degree from a place like Furman boosts your happiness by about 64%. Having an above average income boosted by about 88%, as you can see here. Having a satisfying job boosted by 145%. But simply being married boosts your odds of being happy by 151% on average. And then being in a very happy marriage boosts your odds of being happy by a kind of a staggering 545%. So again, kind of the odds of being very happy in America are, increased by about 545% for Americans who are in a good marriage. And when you kind of look at different variables in the GSS, when you look at things like money, sexual frequency, religious attendance, self-rated health, these are all things that predict happiness in America. But again, nothing in this data set kind of predicts happiness like marital quality does. So to my way of thinking, this suggests to us that, we are, as Aristotle said, social animals. And our ties with others, with family and friends, end up being more important to our welfare than the size of our bank account or the degree on our wall or the kind of career that we have. And that's because our social ties end up affording our lives with meaning, direction, and a sense of solidarity. And really, I think opportunities not only to receive care, but also to give care towards others. I think this is why marriage and family especially are so important to us. And I would say kind of the Midas curse, to kind of bring that Midas idea again into our thinking, into our conversation tonight, is that today I would suggest to you that many of our biggest problems, from falling rates of happiness to cratering fertility to the stagnant character of the American dream, can be traced to the fact that fewer and fewer Americans are finding their way to the altar, either because they can't find someone or because they're not interested in finding someone. So kind of the decline of marriage is, I think, a major kind of factor in some of the curses that we see kind of articulated up on the screen in front of you. So what I'm talking about right now then is there's been a kind of retreat from marriage unfolding in the US. We've seen the marriage rate come down by about 60% since 1970 across the US. That can kind of seem like a kind of a vague statistic. So what does that mean for the young adults who are seated here across this room tonight? Kind of how does this sort of play out for people, in their early 20s and late teens who are sitting again here at Furman tonight? What that means practically for this generation is that we're predicting that about 1 in 3 young adults, roughly early 20s, are not going to get married as they kind of move forward through life. And we will have never had so many adults in this country kind of never getting married, in the US. And, why should that be consequential? Well, I think this kind of the story from my book of Scott, who lives in the outer suburbs of Washington, D.C., kind of gives you some sense of why this is something that we should be concerned about. Now, by the standards of kind of the Midas mindset, nothing should be wrong with Scott's life. He got a graduate degree from Clemson, although that might not be a good thing in this room. He has a good job as a military contractor. He makes more than $100,000 a year now. He has a house of his own. Okay, so doing pretty well from the mindset perspective. But when I spoke to him, he wasn't particularly happy. He said this, you know, I've got degrees on my wall, I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end, is what he said to me. It's not like I can take any of that with me after I die. He said, I've got to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize that I'm alone. I have nobody. He's about 34. And he worries about the kind of fate that might await him if he should ever fall sick later in life. I have no help, you know. If something happened to me tomorrow, there'd be no one for me. So despite his kind of professional success, Scott is struggling with a toxic mix of loneliness, meaninglessness, and sadness. Now, we all know that there are plenty of folks who are single and flourishing, right? And there are plenty of folks who are married and who are floundering. I'm not saying that marriage is some kind of magic potion, but I am a sociologist, and I can say that on average, Americans who are married, especially Americans who are married with kids, maybe surprisingly enough, are more likely towards their lives are meaningful, that they're not lonely, and that they're happy. And we see, in fact, in a recent study from Chicago, that the biggest driver of falling happiness rates in America is the fact that fewer and fewer Americans have managed to kind of put a ring on it, to put it colloquially. And again, I'm relying on the work of the Chicago economist, Sam Peltzman. Kind of can see the quote up here on the screen. So this is kind of the bad news about kind of the way in which marriage has lost ground, and part of it because of the Midas mindset. And fewer Americans are managing to find their way into marriage and to remain married in America today. So the question that might be in your head is there any good news? Any good news to convey tonight? And I think there is actually some good news to convey to you tonight. And that is that a large minority of Americans are forging what I call kind of family first marriages that are typically happy and typically stable. And in my book, I identify kind of 4 groups of Americans. I call them kind of the masters of marriage, who are especially likely to be forging these marriages today. And they are Asian Americans, conservative Americans, the faithful or religious Americans, and then strivers or college educated Americans. So what's their secret? In the book, I talk about kind of basically 5 pillars of a family first marriage that are associated with their success when it comes to marriage. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on 3 of these different pillars tonight: communion, commitment, and community. And you'll also see, as I kind of talk about these 3 different pillars, how they kind of represent ways in which, at least implicitly or explicitly, successfully married couples often are kind of rejecting a lot of elite ideas about family and love and relationships, hence the subtitle about the importance of defying elites in America. So when it comes to communion, I think we often have our elites kind of stressing a me first approach to marriage that privileges autonomy and freedom and self-interest. Okay, so again, a kind of a me first approach to marriage. We can see this, for instance, when it comes to money. Susie Orman is just one of many voices in our culture. Of course, she's a pretty famous financial guru, kind of encouraging couples today to have a kind of his account and a hers account. And in this case, she's saying, because your marriage might not work out, and it's good to have your own nest egg to fall back on. But there are kind of many voices out there in the Atlantic and in the professional financial world who kind of encourage couples to kind of keep their own accounts. But it's kind of emblematic from my perspective of this more me first approach to marriage. But as I spoke to ordinary couples across the US and then also analyzed it, I got the sense that couples who kind of took a different path were more likely to be flourishing. I'm thinking, for instance, of a couple that I call John and Maria Erickson. They met in the 82nd Airborne, and they were getting ready to deploy to Iraq. They were engaged, about to get married. And so one day Maria headed to the store to get some items for both of them. And her list included some expensive items like ballistic glasses. She said they're really expensive, something like $160. And so when Maria came back with those items, she expected John to kind of pay her back for these glasses. But at that point, John just kissed her on the forehead and said to her, "What is yours is mine, and mine is yours. And now we're going to be married. It's all going to be equal." And this is kind of the first step that they took towards kind of pooling their resources. And once they were married, they had joint accounts. And this has kind of helped to fuel a virtuous cycle for them of communication, trust, and mutual dependency that's been part and parcel of their marriage of more than 20 years as a couple with a couple of kids. And they're by no means outliers. We see in our own YouGov survey that couples who have joint accounts are markedly happier here, and they're also less likely to think about divorce as potentially in their future. Now, if you've had any social science training, you might be a little skeptical of this finding, because you might be kind of wondering, is Wilcox just kind of thinking, about a correlation that's not causal? Maybe the kinds of couples who are happier are also more likely to kind of merge their money or share their finances. And that's a kind of a legitimate, I think, concern you might have about this particular argument. But we do have a new study, actually just profiled in the New York Times about 2.5 days ago, where they randomly assigned newlywed couples to 3 different conditions: joint accounts, separate accounts, and to kind of do as they pleased financially. And they found in this new research, again, it's the New York Times, you can look it up, it's about 2 days old there in Times, the couples who were randomly assigned to joint accounts did markedly better in the first 2 years of marriage than the other 2 groups in this particular experimental study. It kind of just gives us a sense that, again, taking a more we before me approach, in this case to money, is linked to better outcomes. So sort of fostering that sense of communion in marriage tends to foster also kind of a sense of unity and teamwork and mutual, I think, service that are conducive to happier and more stable marriages. So again, this is the point about communion in my book. What about commitment? Well, again, I think too often, both really since the 70s and even more so maybe recently, our elites have been kind of discounting the values of marital permanence, heading into marriage, and then now even kind of sexual fidelity as well. And you kind of can probably think of numerous examples of how kind of elites have, in different ways, kind of discounted the importance of marital permanence and also the importance of sexual fidelity. But on that latter point, what do you think is a recent example of the way in which our elites are kind of discounting the importance of fidelity in marriage? Where have you kind of seen that messaging emerge in the last year or so? What's been the sort of kind of thing you may have noticed in some prominent publications, like, again, the New York Times, for instance, or the Wall Street Journal, or New York Magazine? Yes, sir. Exactly. So we're seeing a lot of sort of discourse recently about kind of polyamory or open relationships. And, one, I think, particularly evocative example was released last spring, just after my book came out. And it was about a woman named Molly Winter. And the article was entitled, again, the New York Times, "How a Polyamorous Mom Had a Big Sexual Adventure and Found Herself," describing her new book, which is called More. And this book chronicles kind of her adventures in Brooklyn. Seems like all these writers come from Brooklyn. I don't know what's going on in Brooklyn, but there was, she's from Brooklyn. I have another mention in my book of another writer kind of making some interesting arguments too from Brooklyn. But again, kind of just give you a sense of how our elites are, in this case, really discounting the importance of fidelity now when it comes to marriage. And yet again, when I spoke to ordinary couples across the U.S., had this strong sense that couples who kind of prioritize fidelity in their marriage were more likely to be flourishing. Thinking here of a guy that I call Patrick in the book. He's actually not conservative or religious, but he's a kind of family-oriented guy. And this tall, handsome, and well-spoken redhead in sales from Central Virginia is careful about protecting his marriage of more than 20 years. He meets a lot of people in his work. He plays guitar in a band on the side. He also travels a lot. I think these are all factors that could boost his risk for infidelity. But he's intentional about protecting his marriage in real life. He says, quote, "When I'm meeting new people in my line of work, I talk a lot about my wife and kids. I want them to know I'm a family man," is what he said. He's also careful online, which of course is a new challenge today. He says this: "My wife is tagged in the majority of my posts. My status is listed as married, and interactions online are treated the same way as if in person." He says also, "I don't follow old girlfriends, as there's a reason that they're in that category." Okay. He's kind of maintaining a kind of a fence then, both in the real world and in the virtual world, that kind of just designed to kind of protect himself and protect his marriage. I think it's probably one reason why his wife, Kelly, gives their marriage a 10 with, a scale of 1 to 10, and 10, of course, being the best score when I spoke to her about their marriage. And what we see in the GSS again is that Americans who are married and who kind of embrace the classic view that any kind of sexual relationship outside of marriage is always wrong are happier than their fellow Americans who kind of take this newer view that's not always wrong. And I would say one unfortunate consequence of kind of what we call the Great Awakening, kind of the shift to a more left-leaning perspective since 2014, is that more and more Americans are now taking the view in red up there that, having sex with someone besides your spouse is not always wrong. But just kind of the broader point here when it comes to this pillar of commitment is that different measures of commitment are often associated in the research with marital quality and are often the most powerful predictors of marital happiness in America. So commitment's important. And then the final C tonight is about community. Community. And I would suggest to you that increasingly the elite view is that one kind of community, a kind of religious community, can be an obstacle to living your best life and realizing your best love. Again, an obstacle to living your best life and realizing your best love. So, this can be illustrated in any number of media pieces on kind of religion and family life. But it was kind of particularly salient for me looking at a New Yorker article that was entitled, quote, "A Sociologist of Religion on Protestants, Porn, and the Purity Industrial Complex." And so in this article, in this interview with the sociologist Sam Perry, we were told by Perry that Christian men are afflicted by, quote, "guilt and shame that makes you feel crappy about yourself." That evangelical women, quote, "draw a hard line against their husband's porn use and are, quote, twice as likely to divorce their husband because of his pornography use." And there was a lot more. But the basic story that kind of came through in this New Yorker piece was that kind of religion was this sort of antiquarian thing that made a lot of men and couples guilty and more likely to enter into conflict that could lead to divorce. And it's all kind of related to a kind of old school approach to sex and to pornography that kind of the New Yorker was kind of conveying this piece. So kind of got the sense that faith was not good for families. It was kind of bad for families in reading this piece. But again, as I spoke to ordinary couples, with some exceptions, of course, I found that generally couples who are more religious were more likely to be flourishing and not floundering, kind of contra the sort of takeaway from the New Yorker. I spoke, for instance, to a Black Christian couple in the DC suburbs, Martin and Kimberly. And Martin kind of mentioned to me that, for instance, even when he's on the internet checking out his favorite news and music site, that he's kind of careful about what he's looking at and coming across. He says this, it's one of those things where, the Bible is very clear about fleeing temptation. He said, adding, so yeah, certain sites I won't go on. Then he also talked to you about how he talks regularly with his pastor about his marriage and his family life to kind of stay on the, the straight and narrow path as a husband and father. And likewise, Kimberly kind of had this, pretty poignant story about how she'd been sexually abused as a child And both kind of her prayer life and her sort of church community helped her to navigate this experience of abuse. She says this, but that's how prayer entered, because I had some stuff happen prior to us that made having sex challenging for me, kind of going into marriage. And she said, I'm like, okay, God, you're only going to heal me. Only God can really, truly heal this. And so, again, both because of kind of, from her perspective, the power of prayer and her kind of female co-believers, she was able to kind of navigate this challenge and is now happily married and, is not experiencing problems in the domain of sexual intimacy. So again, this was not kind of the message that the New York was conveying, in its interview with Sam Perry. And when we look at kind of the average story empirically, what we see in America today, and this is based upon this YouGov survey that we did, that Americans who attend church together, for instance, are more happy than those who do not. As this slide up in front of you suggests, there's about a 15 percentage point gap between those who regularly attend together and those who never attend or don't attend. We see in work that Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard has done that women who regularly attend church are about 45% less likely to get divorced than their female peers who don't regularly attend. So it kind of runs against that divorce point in the New Yorker story. And we're also seeing, too, in my work, and then actually in the GSS as well, there is now a gap in sexual frequency for couples who are married couples who are religious versus non-religious in favor of the religious couples. Again, you would never get this from the New Yorker piece. That kind of would lead you to think just the opposite. But again, couples who are religious are having more sex, as this figure indicates, and they're also more likely to be reporting that they're sexually satisfied. So again, I'm not wanting to minimize this idea that some religious couples are struggling, at any one point in their marriages or in any given church community, or that some people who are religious are more likely to struggle with the issue of pornography. But what I want to suggest to you tonight is that on average and in general, Americans who are part of a religious community who have active faith life are, generally speaking, more likely to be flourishing in their marriages and in their families. And that's because the kind of family-first values, virtues, and social networks that are supplied by religion in America typically strengthen and stabilize marriage. And this is not a story you're going to get from the New Yorker. So again, tonight's bad news, I think, is that marriage in America has been in retreat. And that's in part, I would suggest to you, because too many of our elites and now too many ordinary Americans have kind of prioritized or embraced a Midas mindset. They're under the misimpression that life is about money, work, and me, me, me. They've put Mammon oftentimes before marriage. But this is a big mistake, as we've seen, because nothing kind of compares. Nothing supplies, the kind of meaning, direction, solidarity that marriage and family typically offer to Americans today. So I think the challenge in this moment is that we must foster a marriage mindset for our schools, our colleges, on social media, and our churches and homes. You and I have to tell our teenagers that family and friends matter more than the kind of college that they attend or the job that they end up pursuing. Schools like Furman must have classes that underline both the benefits of marriage and family, but also equip students with the kinds of virtues that will allow them to forge good relationships, both as people who are dating and then later on who are getting married and having kids. And we have to figure out ways to bring this message to all walks of life so that marriage is accessible and appealing to all. Because, I would suggest to you tonight, in our heart of hearts, I think, we know that life is not about gold, it's about love. So thank you.
I usually feel like I have like a wind down, but that was a very good ending, and I wasn't yet prepared to. No, that's okay. That's okay. I have invited two of my colleagues to the stage, and they are already here. So I am going to introduce, first of all, Franklin Ellis on my far left, and then David Fleming. Franklin Ellis is Associate Dean and Director of the Center for Interpersonal Connections and Special Assistant to the President for Diversity and Belonging. Dean Ellis earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and philosophy from Coastal Carolina University and a master's degree in mental health counseling from Wright State University and licensure as a professional counselor in Dayton, Ohio. He earned his doctorate in marriage and family therapy from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in Westwood, California. Ellis is a relationship expert trained to work with singles, couples, families, and teams. He specializes in multicultural counseling with a concentration on demonstrating to non-Black or non-African American people how to serve Black or African American people within the mental health system. So you can see why I invited him to this panel. He's our marriage counseling expert. And David Fleming is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Furman University and Senior Researcher at the Riley Institute. He earned his BA from the University of Notre Dame, his MA and PhD in Political Science from the very best university in the world, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that's just because I went there too. A Furman faculty member since 2009, David teaches courses in American politics, political analysis, and public policy. His research interests include education policy, civic education, and political participation. He has published extensively in these areas. Please welcome our panelists. So I've asked each one of our panelists to give a reaction to Brad's talk. They can do so in any way they want. They can offer a comment, they can ask a question, and then we'll open it up to more questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. So, David, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Dr. Wilcox, for your presentation. I'm not sure I'm an expert, but I have been married for 5 years, so maybe I can talk based on that experience. Some of the things that kind of came to mind to me hearing Dr. Wilcox's presentation, obviously there was a big focus on elite messaging as kind of what might be causing decline in marriage rates. And I'm kind of interested in that hypothesis because I think most of us know marriage best through firsthand experience. Either growing up in a two-parent household or not, seeing relationships between friends' parents, and then as we age, we kind of have our own experiences. So I'm kind of interested in the power of these elite messaging being so much more meaningful than everyday lived experiences that we have with marriage, which seems to me would be much more foundational, fundamental, and powerful when it comes to thinking about how people picture themselves, whether they want to be married or whether they get married or not. Some other kind of things that were rolling around in my head that I think are particularly kind of interesting on this topic is just the fundamental challenges that Dr. Wilcox talked about and kind of isolating what kind of relationships between different factors are when they're so complex, particularly when it comes to things like conservatism and religion and marriage that are so intertwined now that it's kind of hard to isolate, what causes what, makes it quite challenging. And then maybe my last or second to last point, kind of the challenge of this is that it's not just that you want to get married; somebody has to want to marry you, right? And so it's a complicated market that I think, given changes in demographics, particularly gender differences in education, seem to make it more difficult now for people to perhaps find matches. And so I'm interested to hear kind of what are standards too high? What can we do? Because my understanding is that something like 81% of people that aren't married want to be married. They will eventually be married. And so it's not necessarily that people no longer want to be married, but maybe they're having a hard time finding the right person to marry. Thank you.
Yeah. Brad, why don't we just have
Yeah,
a
one, I mean,
response to that?
you kind of presented a number of compelling, I think, issues and questions for me to think about, and then I can go to Franklin next after you, David. Thank you. So I would say, in terms of kind of the elite point, I would certainly agree with you that our most proximate experiences of family life are obviously deeply formative in shaping how we ourselves approach, marriage and family. But as you kind of like look at, trends over time and thinking about kind of the 60s to the 70s, what's sort of striking about, that moment in time is you kind of move from a pretty, familistic era to a much more individualistic era. And that's then kind of reflected too in dramatic increases in divorce in the 70s, especially, and then a pretty big uptick in single parenthood as well. And so the question is sort of what was driving that major shift from a more familistic orientation in the 50s and early 60s to a much more individualistic orientation in the late 60s and 70s. And I don't think it was kind of just because people may have seen, flaws in their parents' marriages and family. I think that there were kind of elites who were doing a variety of things in terms of, changing divorce laws in that period of time, who were kind of questioning the value of religion and faith in that time, who were kind of articulating what we call kind of expressive individualism in that time. Tom Wolfe famously described this period as kind of the me decade, the 70s. And so there were ways in which I think elites were kind of pushing the culture away from a familistic orientation and towards a more individualistic orientation, and that people then took their cues in part from the messages they were encountering. College campuses, songs and other media, other venues as well. So that's part of the story in terms of your first question. In terms of the second point about kind of the complexity of things like religion and conservatism as they relate to the marriage story in America, would certainly acknowledge that there are many factors that kind of shape the character and context of American family life and marriages in particular. But in terms of identifying those four groups, Asian Americans, religious Americans, college-educated Americans, and conservative Americans, I did see kind of in a multivariate context that each of those four sets of variables all predicted in America today being married. And actually, the conservative piece kind of surprised me because I thought that once I included just a measure of religion in my multivariate models, that any kind of ideological story would disappear. But I found that even including religion in the models, still found that ideology was an independent predictor of both being married in the first place and also being happily married in the second place. And that was not what I was expecting when I began this project. So that's why I kind of settled on these four groups. And then two, it's also worth noting that for each of these four groups, a majority of Asian Americans, a majority of religious Americans, a majority of conservative Americans, and a majority of college-educated Americans aged 18 to 55 are married, and their comparison categories typically are not the majority married. So, only a minority of liberals are married, only a minority of secular Americans are married, for instance, and only a minority of non-college-educated Americans are married. So, I think there is something about the way in which these distinct groups either have specific cultural commitments or networks, or in the case of college-educated Americans, access to more economic resources, including higher salaries, more full-time working men, and more shared assets in terms of like owning a home together as a couple, that help to explain why these four groups are more likely today to be succeeding at marriage. And then the last point in terms of recognizing that a lot of Americans would like to get married, but don't end up getting married. I think that's going to become even more common as we go forward today. And I would say that there are Well, I'd say three things about that kind of point. One is that there has been a modest decline in the share of Americans who say they want to get married. But I think more importantly, it's not that people don't necessarily want to get married, so they don't prioritize it in the same way that they're prioritizing like their education and their careers. And one example that I gave in talking to the New York Times about this is that I had an RA 2 years ago, and I asked him kind of, what's your plan for the next 10 years in terms of, your career and education? He had a very detailed plan for how he was going to do, this degree, do this job. It's all kind of mapped out in his head. I asked him, would you like to get married? He said, oh, yeah. Uh-huh. I'm like, well, what's your plan to get married? Complete silence. And I said to him, are you dating anyone? No. Have you asked anyone out on a date? No. So I think that there's a way in which we haven't done enough to kind of, prepare and equip folks who even do want to get married to kind of recognize that this, time of life in your 20s and early 30s is a pretty important time to be actually, making progress and dating and finding someone if you hope to get married. And then the third point that I'd make is that I have spoken to a lot of young women, both at UVA and not, beyond UVA, and on both the left and the right. And they often say it's hard for them to find guys who have, a clear sense of agency, a clear kind of professional orientation, and a kind of interest in being committed to them and to some kind of common future as a couple together. Now, guys have their own concerns too in this mix, but the female concerns have been particularly salient as I've been talking to ordinary young adults. And I think it is the case too. We're living in a world where almost 60% of college students are female, obviously just 40% are male. And it's harder for women, especially who are college educated, to find guys who are in the same educational bracket. But as we know from some newer research, it's even harder for less educated women to find men who are, gainfully employed full time and doing reasonably well economically, among other things. So there's also a gender piece here that's just kind of playing out. I think we need to do more as a society to help kind of equip our young men to flourish more in school, flourish more in college and trade school, in their early work, and to recognize and appreciate, that they can play an important role both when it comes to dating, and then down the road when it comes to being married with kids as well. So kind of just doing more to encourage younger men to flourish in ways that would make them better partners and then spouses and fathers down the road.
Yeah, good. Just to put a little note on top of one of your points, I think it's David Brooks who talks about how in the past life was planned around a cornerstone, and that cornerstone was marriage. You lay the cornerstone first, and then you build the life. But today we think of marriage more as the capstone. You build your life, and then you put marriage as the fulfillment of all of that. Well, what if you never get the house fully built, then? Okay, that's enough for me. Franklin, please.
All right, thanks. A lot of things stood out. First, I would say I felt like you were speaking my life. I am the 1 in 3 who will probably never be married. Not because I don't want to, because I think I also had the plan for school, right, career, and did not have the plan for marriage, right? And so it's sort of like when you graduate from high school, you have a whole ocean to fish from. You graduate with a bachelor's degree, and your ocean turns into a sea, right? Then you graduate with a master's, and your sea turns into a lake. And you graduate with a PhD, and your lake turns into a puddle, and ain't no fish in a puddle, right? So it does become harder because what you're seeking is this sense of equity in a partner, right? Reciprocity. I want you to bring some of the same things. They don't have to be exact, right? But I want us to be, we can be equally yoked and even equally yoked from separate eggs, right? I also, in hearing Dr. Wilcox speaking, some of the things that stood out is this, I think we have control, or we believe we do, over our career and our success. But what's hard is when we are in relation with others, we don't have control over that. And so I can put all my energy into career and success because I am scared of being vulnerable and rejected, right? And so to be in relation with others, we have to be okay with vulnerability, and rejection is hard, right? And so I can see this fear that feeds into um, not wanting to date, not being able to find a partner because my career is never going to let me down. And really, it's just I'm fearful of being hurt. And so we distance ourselves from that. And then we tell ourselves the stories of, I'm okay, right? Like I have a whole mantra. I use Maya Angelou. I sustain myself with the love of my friends, right? Which is true. And one day, maybe, a partner would be great. But it's easier for me to just say, I have a beautiful life with a lot of friends. And not saying that that isn't true for a lot of folks, but I do realize we are social animals, right? We do need community and connection. I would say that if we look at existential crises, it is the search for the other and isolation. We never truly know who we are without being reflected through other people. And I think when we are in relationship with someone, it really shows us who we are. And so I think if we leaned more into the fear of being rejected and didn't allow that to deter us from finding that, I think a lot more people would be in a relationship. And it is hard. Like dating is hard, right? And nowadays, it's all the apps, which make it even worse because it is this. We're waiting for the next best thing to come along, and you might find the best thing, but then you let it go because something could be better and it's not. And so I just think technology has really influenced that and the fear that we have.
I'm so glad I got married before they invented iPhones. Why don't I? Well, go ahead, Brad. Okay, I just want to follow up, Franklin, because you have so much experience with counseling couples and the challenges that marriages have, but also people who aren't married or want to be married or are trying to be married. Um, do you see some of the same things that Brad is talking about, but more anecdotally? How do you overcome those? Just give us some sense of your experience.
Yeah, a lot of the things that we see is it's the lack of communication that people, when we talk about happy marriages, right? I think sometimes if we bring in religion, scripture, a lot of the times when people talk about like the man is the head of the household, but interpret it incorrectly, right?
Yeah.
And so that means my partner should listen to me and that's it. And not listen to your partner, where, the man should also listen to his partner and care for them, right? And so it's that lack of communication that happens, right? Like we don't talk about what relationship looks like. We do come from our nuclear families. We see relationships and we learn them from that. And then we essentially project that onto our partners without talking about what was your parents' relationship like. This is what mine were like, right? How do you view marriage? What does it mean? And then oftentimes when we get married or in a relationship, we believe that the vows and the ring take care of everything, and we stop doing the things that made the person fall in love with us in the first place, right? Or we stop listening and not doing the things that make us don't like it, right? So I think a lot of it is just this breakdown in communication, to allow ourselves to have happiness in it, right?
Good, Brad.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Franklin has said resonates with me. I guess I would just want to underline this idea of the importance of risk. And obviously, one of the things that we're seeing, in reflections from people like Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist at NYU, is that younger adults, for a wide range of reasons, are just more reluctant to engage in risk on a variety of different fronts. And so we're seeing, less dating, we're seeing less, adolescent driving, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have to kind of help young adults to sort of realize that kind of living life to the fullest requires taking risks. And certainly one risk is, asking someone out on a date, saying yes to that date, maybe going again on a date when you're not quite sure if there's a good connection there, and kind of letting things play out, recognizing that this is sort of the way, you know, things get done if you really have an eye towards, marriage and family life down the road. And again, that kind of, for the folks who are at Furman as undergraduates here right now, the next decade of your life is important, not just educationally and professionally, but also relationally. That, many people will meet, their spouse in their 20s, if they meet their spouse, if they meet a spouse. And so it's kind of important for you to be as intentional about dating and relationships as you are about, your future education and career as well. And so that's obviously a point I'm trying to underline tonight, but it does go back to the point you're making, Franklin, about risk and just being aware of the need to open yourself out to dating, and recognizing that can lead to rejection and loss and anger at times, but also can lead, to the altar, so to speak, as well.
David, I'd like to ask you about, your research. You do research on schools, and a lot of it is educational outcomes. What do you see in your own research about the role that families play in educational outcomes for the children?
Yeah, I think one of the more consistent findings in studies of educational outcomes is this the kind of importance of the family background and family structure that children come from. Often have bigger impacts than kind of what happens in the schools. Is the background that the students have, including kind of family income, as well as things like the social networks that students have available to them that extend, include the family, but extend beyond the family. So there's definitely lots of research that demonstrates the importance of kind of the family background in terms of student outcomes. The great challenge, however, is that marriages and families are not created randomly. Sometimes the type of people who might be more likely to get married might be the type of people who would be more active in their children's education, for example, perhaps. So is it the getting married is the secret thing, or is it just the type of people that get married or stay married? And that's kind of a difficult for us to disentangle when we're examining kind of these education outcomes. But certainly when it comes to kind of education, that a student's family life, kind of what's happening in their family, history of trauma in the family can affect how a student does on test scores, without a doubt.
Brad, this brings up an interesting part of your background. You were raised by a single mom, but you got involved in doing research on marriages. How did all that happen? How did your background influence what you study and what approach you take?
Yeah, so Brent, I was raised by a single mom, as you just mentioned. My dad died when I was 3. My mom never remarried, and when I was actually at UVA as an undergraduate, kind of was thinking about kind of the impact of growing up without a father, and kind of thinking about it intellectually, and kind of came to the conclusion as an undergraduate that kind of marriage was an institution that typically would connect dads to their children. And so this was kind of my my collegiate conclusion, and I kind of used that to then kind of shape to some extent work that I did in graduate school at Princeton in kind of sociology of family. But it's important to acknowledge, I would say, 2 different points here. One is that when you look at a lot of the outcomes, kids who are raised in single parent families or other kinds of families that are not intact, typically do fine. That most, for instance, young men who are raised in a non-intact family don't end up going to jail or prison, for instance. So that's certainly an important truth. Having a non-intact family is not a death sentence, in terms of what we see in the research. At the same time, I can sort of say kind of on average, and also kind of in a more collective way, if you're coming from a non-intact family, you're more likely to experience negative outcomes. So one of the most striking things in the book is I find that young men who come from non-intact families are more likely to go to prison or jail than they are to graduate from a college like Furman. And whether it's single mother, single father, adoptive family, step family, all those kinds of families, young men again are more likely to spend some time in jail or in prison than they are to graduate from college. And by contrast, young men who come from intact families with their mom and dad, at home growing up, are about 4 times more likely to graduate from a college than they are to spend any time in prison or in jail. Now, again, most young men across the board don't go to prison or jail, but you can kind of see how there are some big differences. And then in communities where there's lots of family instability, you do tend to see more crime, more school failure, and much lower levels of economic mobility. And that's just sort of fancy social science talk for kind of the American dream. And Raj Chetty at Harvard has found, for instance, that the number one predictor of poor kids rising into affluence as adults at the community level is the share of two-parent families in a community. And so he finds that there's a lot more mobility for poor kids in a metro area like Salt Lake City than there is for kids growing up in the Charlotte, North Carolina metro area. And a big part of that Charlotte versus Salt Lake City story is the fact that there are many more two-parent families in the Salt Lake City metro area than there are in the in the Charlotte metro area. So at the civilization level, which is one reason why the civilization is in my subtitle, when the family flounders, you often see neighborhoods and communities, cities, countries are more likely to be also paying a price as well.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all. So be thinking about what you're going to say. But let's just assume that we all agree that you're right. We've got to do something about the family. To who or what institutions does that responsibility fall? In other words, is it the government or something else that should be, doing more encouraging of this? Are there policy proposals? Are there cultural proposals? What should we be doing? And I don't care who starts. I'm not directing this at you, but I know you have a lot in your book about this. But, David, you've been thinking about this as well, so I don't want to cut you off if you have something.
Okay. Having read Dr. Wilcox's book, I'm not going to steal the thunder about his policy prescriptions, but I think a solution, assuming that this is the problem that is identified correctly, that to fix a problem this big is going to require more than changes to the earned income tax credit or child tax credits or something like that. That, from my perspective, should involve parents talking to their children about the importance of marriage. If that's something that elites are arguing against that, then I think it'd be most effective coming from parents.
And Franklin, everybody should be in counseling, right?
Yes. That's a really great question. I sit here and I think about I think we have to shift from this I back into we, right? Ubuntu, right? This I am because we are. And I think it is not just family parent thing, but I think it is a community thing. Like, it takes a village, right? And we can talk about these things. I think my parents have been married in March 48 years and been together for 52, right? But part of that wasn't just because my mom and my dad had their parents. Well, actually, my father, my mother's passed away, right? But they had community members who, when they were having issues in marriage, would actually pull them aside and have conversations with them about how to improve their marriage. So I think it just takes all of us really coming together and going back to a we versus I.
Oh, interesting. Very good. Brad.
Yeah, but I do talk about kind of some public policies I think could be helpful. So getting rid of what's called the marriage penalty. So a lot of working class couples with kids, for instance, especially in terms when it comes to Medicaid, which is government basically insurance for lower income families, have to kind of choose between marriage and Medicaid. And I've talked to numerous couples in this situation where, he might be earning maybe $30,000. She's earning $10,000. They have one or two kids together. She's on Medicaid. The kids are on Medicaid. He's not getting insurance from his job. She's not getting insurance from her job. And so there's kind of this calculus that, at least for right now, they're going to kind of live together, not marry, and rely upon Medicaid for their health insurance for mom and for the kids. And there's also kind of similar penalties for food stamps and some other government programs as well. So we could, I think, address that issue. We could also, I think, talk about what's called the success sequence in our schools. This idea that if you get at least a high school degree, you work full time, and you get married before having kids, your odds of being poor are just 3%. Your odds of being in the middle class are 86% or higher, kind of just giving adults a sense of how much education, work, and marriage are key to succeeding in America today. I talked to you about the potential value of school choice in terms of giving more educational options to kids, both middle class and I think poor kids especially, and how that's linked in some research that I've done to better family outcomes. So these are some of the policies I think could be helpful. But I would certainly agree that, at the end of the day, having parents and community members kind of getting on board with this message is also extremely important. But then to other kind of organs of cultural influence. So universities and colleges, public middle schools, public high schools, the media would all be kinds of things that would be helpful in terms of kind of steering the culture in a better direction. And now I would say also to, social media. And then finally, I would talk about the role of churches as well. And there is a new ministry called Communio, which is serving both Protestant and Catholic churches across the U.S. And they're giving churches a much more holistic approach to family ministry that I think is going to be helpful as well, and kind of preparing both singles for dating and marriage, and then also helping couples, strengthen their marriage and then kind of navigate the challenges that most of us who've been married a long time tend to encounter at one point or another, in our marriages as well. So the point I would make, kind of the big point here, is just it's going to require a lot of different kinds of institutions, the government, the church, schools, the media, to kind of reorient their thinking. And we could think about, historical parallels to everything from, smoking to teen pregnancy, where there's been a kind of a shift in thinking that led to then a shift in behavior that was in the main good for our country.
I would have one additional thing. There's a joke in my introduction to American politics class that if I ever ask a question, you could always say political polarization and you would be right. And I think this is kind of another example to some degree of that we've kind of seeing gender differences, particularly amongst young people, when it comes to kind of party affiliation and party identification, that I think as partisanship becomes such a bigger part of self-identity, that's going to make relationships, and we've kind of been hearing stories about this, relationships more difficult, kind of inter-party relationships being less and less common. So the types of things that we would need to do to decrease political polarization, I think, would also make people get married.
Yeah, because of that polarization, that makes your puddle, Franklin, even smaller, right? Because now you got to make sure that it's the right political party in there as well.
Yeah, I think the concern is that marriage becomes politicized and it becomes something that conservatives do or Republicans do. They get married, right? And I think if it has that stereotype, that would make it something different than smoking or something like that. That did not have that partisan stereotype.
So I think that's a very good point, David. I think, and as you all can guess, I'm more conservative, but I do think we may see, even surprisingly, kind of in this polarized moment that we're living in, that there are going to be kind of moderate Democratic figures emerge, or people on the left, kind of in the more moderate left camp, emerge in the coming years. We're going to want to kind of reclaim the center, so to speak, on a variety of issues, and I'm obviously hoping that marriage will be one of those as well. And so, if we were to see, some mainstream publications like the Atlantic or the New York Times kind of shifting on the marriage front, for instance, if we were to see, some mainstream politicians as well, kind of in the Democratic Party, kind of making new moves on this issue, that would be really helpful to kind of depolarize and make this more of a consensus. And I think for many Democrats, the surprising loss that they experienced in the recent presidential election has got them thinking about maybe the need to reposition themselves in some of these cultural questions. So we'll see. I hope it happens.
You talk in your book about elite hypocrisy on this idea that the elites preach radical individual autonomy, but they don't really practice it. They get married, they stay married, they have children, they raise children, and boy, are they good parents. But then it's the people that don't have the resources to do that end up living that life of freedom that the elites often talk about. So he didn't talk about that. So I just told you it's in the book. All right. Sim has a microphone. Do you have the microphone? No, Maddie has the microphone. Maddie has a microphone. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and Maddie will run around and or pass it right next to Lane, who's right there.
Thank you. This is for Dr. Wilcox. In terms of data, how has online dependency for human interaction and the isolation from the COVID era changed marriage and fertility rates since 2020?
Great question. So I think we do see a kind of a dip in marriage rates in the immediate wake of COVID. But my kind of deeper concern here is it's just kind of fueling declines in dating as well. The idea being, of course, is that a lot of teenagers and young adults kind of lost opportunities to hang out with one another, to cultivate the kinds of social skills that would make them better able to kind of date, mate, and marry. So I think that COVID was certainly a problem in that regard. But I kind of extend the point beyond just COVID and say that we're seeing now dramatic declines in dating and marriage and fertility, not just obviously in the United States, but across the globe. And I do think that this device, is very much implicated, and social media is very much implicated in this shift we're seeing across the globe, because people are just not spending as much time interacting in person. They're becoming polarized, as David was just mentioning, too. Women moving to the left, men a little to the right. And I think, too, a colleague of mine has a study coming out tomorrow on AI and romantic and sexual companions, and finds that about 1 in 3 young men have had some kind of AI, companion kind of app that they've engaged, and about 1 in 4 young women have. So I think that what I call kind of electronic opiates are going to make it tempting for a lot of younger adults to just kind of migrate towards screens and away from kind of the in-person relationships that are so crucial to, again, dating, mating, and marrying. So it's a major challenge for us, that this sort of the rise of extremely engrossing, enticing, entertaining, technologies that I think are going to degrade and distract us, degrade our relationship capacities and distract us from entering into relationships. And that's a big concern that I have about technology.
There was an extremely scary article in the New York Times last week about a woman who has fallen in love with her AI friend, and she's spending an enormous number of hours, and she's married, not to the AI guy, but to a real person. But she's spending far more time with her AI person, who actually responds to everything that she. I mean, it just frankly.
But I think that goes back to the rejection and fear. So I now have AI that makes me feel good. It says exactly what I need to hear. My partner does not, exactly. Right? And so, I'm going to lean into that.
Yeah.
I think when you're talking about like COVID, the anxiety that came from that, right? The anxious generation. And so there is this loss of just skills on how interpersonal, like how do I just talk to people? And that becomes hard. And then we don't have patience. And so I tell folks, when you're dating, give people at least 3 dates, right? The person who shows up the first time, go on the second date to say, ooh, is it the same person or someone different? And if it's someone different, go on the third one, and then you know who it is, and then you decide not to date or not, right? So we lose that patience. We still have that anxiety and that fear that is from that. AI is amazing because, again, it takes away the fear. I'm going to talk and interact with something that tells me exactly what I want to hear.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yes. Okay, David Gandolfo.
Hi, I'm in the philosophy department here. Thanks, Dr. Wilcox. My question for Dr. Wilcox. I haven't read your book, and this is probably something. It seems like something that would be addressed in the book. Where does gay marriage fit? It seems to me that given how important marriage is for having for one's own personal growth, for one's so that one
flourishes with their partner, having someone to share life with, having someone to raise children with, because of the importance of all of that, shouldn't gay marriage be included? And since you haven't defined it in the talk tonight, I'm unsure what the answer will be, either because you haven't defined it because you're assuming a traditional definition of marriage between a man and a woman, or you haven't defined it because you're just accepting the legal definition of marriage, which is we have and celebrate gay marriage. So given the importance of marriage, it seems to me that gay marriage should be included. I'm wondering how you treat it in the book. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the book, I actually don't include any same-sex couples because I was focusing in large part more on heterosexual couples who had kids. And one of the things that we see in the data today is that less than 0.5% of kids are being raised in same-sex, married families. So there was obviously a lot of cultural attention on gay marriage in the last 20 years, give or take. But as kind of gay marriage is sort of rolled out for Americans, we don't actually see that many gay and lesbian couples actually, raising kids compared to kind of the broader population. It is the case that when you look at outcomes, gay and lesbian couples who are married tend to do better than their gay and lesbian peers who are not married in ways that would be roughly parallel to what we see in looking at heterosexual married adults. So that's, I think, kind of consistent with this idea that marriage as an institution, as an expression of, legal and normative community, is beneficial to both straight and same-sex couples. But when it comes to kind of thinking about the role of marriage in kids' lives, I think we don't have as clear an idea about, how gay marriage affects kids. There are certainly many studies saying that kids who are raised by same-sex couples or same-sex married couples do okay or do well, and there's some studies that would kind of come to the opposite conclusion. My own hypothesis is kind of going forward, we'll sort of see, if we have, and it's hard to get large studies of kids being raised by same-sex married couples, because they are comparatively rare. And so if you're just doing a random, sample, it's hard to get, a decent sample size for same-sex families. But my kind of hypothesis is that kind of going forward, that kids who are being raised by same-sex, married couples are probably going to have more social and emotional challenges because one of their parents necessarily, and sometimes both of their parents are not their biological parents. And we do see in my own, book and my own research is that kids who are raised in adoptive households, for instance, or in kids who are raised in step families as well, are more likely to be, struggling socially and emotionally. So I expect that kind of when we have like a gold standard longitudinal study of kids raised in same-sex families compared to kids raised in intact heterosexual married families, there'll be some differences there. But in this book, I focus on heterosexual couples, primarily because they're much more common, when it comes to kind of raising kids in America.
Thank you. Noah.
Well, I sort of knew the LGBTQ question would come out at some point, but yeah, thank you for asking. I was about to ask you. Yep. This question's for Dr. Wilcox. You talk about the role of social media and how it plays a role in opinions on marriage. I also want to figure out the role of mainstream media that's risen, like the not just New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, even CNN and Fox News, the advent of the 24-hour news cycle, and the rise of alternative media sources, especially on the internet. What role do those play in opinions on marriage?
Great question. So I think when it comes to kind of like the mainstream media, or what's called the legacy media, there's been a tendency, because most mainstream journalists are more progressive culturally and politically, to kind of assume that every single innovation that comes down the pike, so to speak, in the sort of relationship and family domain is good and should be baptized, as such. And the sort of polyamory coverage that I mentioned tonight briefly is one example of that. I mean, there's been stories in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine. There was even a new TV series called From Couple to Thruple. And I think it's kind of emblematic of, again, the way in which, because they have kind of progressive assumptions about the way the world works, kind of this idea that, things are getting better and better as we kind of become more progressive on any number of fronts. They tend to be more suspicious of tradition and of traditional norms and customs. They tend to not recognize and appreciate, I would say from a more Burkean perspective, that many traditions and customs evolved over decades or centuries for real good reasons. So again, I think the mainstream media has not been particularly helpful on the marriage and family front, because they're more likely to kind of embrace a rejection of tradition tout court and a more individualistic approach to relationships, a more me first mindset, to use that phrase. But I think it's a lot more complicated now with the rise of alternative media and podcasts. And we saw, obviously, in the most recent presidential election, that the mainstream media's hold over the American kind of population is, I think, slipped. And it's not necessarily always a good thing. And there are plenty of voices like Andrew Tate that I mentioned in social media who are kind of giving us messages that aren't necessarily progressive, but are certainly not very helpful or constructive. But I do think in this newer world that we're living in media-wise, that there's more space for a kind of a family-friendly message to be articulated and to do kind of an end run around kind of the more legacy or mainstream media approach to these questions. And I mean, you could kind of fill in maybe if you're, depends on what your podcast diet is, for instance, or YouTube diet is. But there are now some pretty prominent voices who they're not perfect by any means, but they do tend to articulate in a very public and powerful way and get lots of listeners and viewers now a pretty strong pro kind of marriage message. And that's a newer feature of our newer media landscape.
What was that podcast that Kamala Harris was on? You know it. Oh.
Well, yeah.
Oh, Call Your Daddy.
No,
Yeah, I did listen to that one. I have to admit that probably would not fit your family-friendly mold. We're going to have to leave it there. Oh, no. Okay, Luke, one last question. We have 2 minutes.
So my question is for the whole panel. In the panel section, you all discussed about like difficulty in finding a spouse like with the same educational background, and especially given the gender gap in higher education settings. So my question is that something we should seek to marry within our same educational background? If it is, how can we then overcome that gender gap? And if it's not better, how do we overcome the mindset that it is better?
That's a good question. What I would say is that what you value, right? I would seek your partner based off of what you value. Generally, I would say, what are your 5 non-negotiables? What are the things that a person has to have or cannot have in order for you to be with them? And then anybody you date, do they meet your 5 non-negotiables? And if education isn't one of them, then that's fine. If it is, then make sure that partner has that. Because what I can tell you is, if you have your 5 non-negotiables and anybody you're with, they don't meet one of them, it's not going to work, right? And so I think some of that is the stories that you tell yourself. So you know what you're seeking, you know what you need, you know what's going to make you happy in a partner, and then communicate that. So I think just a lot of it is your own reframing of self and knowing what you want.
So there's a recent study that came out from the American Institute for Boys and Men on this question. And what it finds is that sort of surprisingly, there's been real, not a huge decline among college-educated women in their likelihood of getting married. where the big decline is among less educated women. And they kind of unpack that, and what they found is that for college-educated women today, they're either marrying guys who are college educated and employed in some reasonable job, or they're marrying guys who don't have college degrees but are doing pretty well financially. So just going to give you a concrete example, my sister-in-law has a CPA from University of Washington. She did very well on Amazon, and she married an EMT in the King County Fire Department in Washington State, who also did well as a firefighter in King County, and they've been married about 25 years, and they're doing well. But his job is, again, well paying, it's stable. He's got his own unique gifts and talents, and she's got her own unique gifts and talents. So I think it's important for people to realize, particularly again in this newer world that we're living in, for women, you can marry guys who don't have a college degree, even if you yourself do, but who have other kinds of things that are going for them. And if you do want to get married, I think you also have to be just aware of the fact that there aren't a one-to-one, or there isn't a one-to-one sort of ratio for college-educated men to women. And so given that reality, you may want to kind of broaden your thinking and make sure that your 5 non-negotiables don't incorporate a college degree, but they might incorporate a shared faith or a good job or a sense of humor or whatever it might be.
Cute.
Cute or strong.
Really, come on.
Whatever it is. But I think people need to think a little bit more broadly for both women and men, and recognize that that college degree is not the be all and end all necessarily for a good marriage.
I'm not sure too much to add besides give grace to yourself and to the person you're asking out on a date.
Amen. Okay, 2 things before we go. 1, if you're in the Furman community, and that's a pretty broad group of people, tacos in Tocqueville tomorrow at 12:30 in the Poli-Sci department, Politics and International Affairs, and you're all welcome. Dr. Kearney will be there, as well as Dr. Wilcox, and you'll get a smaller group to be able to talk. Secondly, tomorrow night at 5 o'clock in this very room, we're going to have an On Discourse event, which means you don't have to listen to somebody the whole time. You get to talk. So Dr. Kearney, Dr. Wilcox, and I saw Kelsey Hampel out there. Yes, she's way back there. Dr. Hampel will be there as well. And they'll give presentations, and then we will talk about families at our tables. And that will be a really exciting time. So come out at 5 o'clock. Now, let's give our panelists a big round of applause. And thank you, Brad. And you are dismissed.